Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you're a returning listener, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, welcome. It's great to have you on board. So without further ado, let's get started on today's story. Ireland Crimes and Mysteries is presented by GoLoud, Ireland's leading audio publisher and the home of Irish podcasts. Find new episodes on the podcast first on the GoLoud app and on your favourite podcast platform. Hey guys, and welcome to today's episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Now, I just want to give you a quick heads up before we start. The episode contains references to violence and sexual assault, so just please listen with care. In 1979, life in Kildare was shaped by routine. It was a lot quieter than it is nowadays. Families were large, neighbours knew each other, and most people kept to the same routine every week. People relied on the bus, walked the roads they knew, worked their job and went home. If someone was late, you waited for them. There was no mobile phones to check on them back in those days. You just trusted they would arrive when they could.
Back in the late 70s, Kildare town would have been a lot smaller than it is now. It would have been more of a village, really.
It was a quiet country area. You had access to Dublin and you had access to the Wicklow Mountains. A grand place to live, really and truly.
Oh, there was a great camaraderie in it, really, and everyone knew everyone and very supportive of each other as well,
Now, Phyllis Murphy grew up in that world. She was from a family of 10 children and she was the third youngest. The house was busy and everyone had to pull their weight. Her father worked in the Defence Forces and she grew up in Kildare town. The family were well used to structure and responsibility. It was a very normal upbringing where you helped when you were asked and did your family chores and were respectful to your elders. When Phyllis was 7, her mother died. Now, Phyllis had formed a close bond with the Martins, who were a family that lived next door, but they moved to Newbridge in 1969. So in 1978, Phyllis moved to stay with the Martins' grandmother in Rathangan. From a young age, Phyllis was known as steady, quiet and reliable. She kept her belongings neat, followed her routines and avoided any behaviour that would draw attention to her. She was gentle in nature and soft-spoken. When she relaxed around someone she trusted, she was warm and easygoing. But she was not someone who pushed herself forward on people or broke away from any familiar routines. That year of 1979, she had ended a long relationship that had lasted several years. It had basically run its course and she'd moved on. Afterwards, she focused on work and home. She spoke to her sister about the future and said she hoped that in time she would meet someone else. She wanted a man who treated her properly, but she was in no rush. She was practical, knew her own standards and was clear about the kind of life she wanted to live. As I said, at this stage she was living in Rathangan and she was working in Curra knitwear as a cutter. It was a reliable job and she was someone who was very reliable at her work.
I worked in Curra knitwear or in Newbridge and we used to socialise together and she took pride in her work, and where we worked, we made baby clothes. She was in charge of cutting out the patrons, and if you made a mess of one of the things she was after cutting out for you, you'd nearly be afraid to say it to her, but she'd always fix it with a smile on her face for you. She was a very sensible 23-year-old. She was motherly, like you'd think she was more than 23, a rocket sense.
She took the bus, she worked her shift, she visited her family and stayed within her familiar surroundings. She wasn't someone who stayed out late and she would certainly not take a lift from a stranger. Family remained central in Phyllis's life. She was close to her brothers and sisters and visited them very often. She enjoyed small, everyday moments with them. As Christmas approached, she was really looking forward to the break from work and, like any of us, spending time with her family. She loved the run-up to Christmas and getting her presents and taking part in all the preparations. There was nothing in her behaviour at the time that suggested stress, worry or anything out of place. She seemed settled and in good form. People who saw her in the days before Christmas remembered her as being cheerful and relaxed. She was talking about her plans, getting her shopping sorted and getting ready for the holidays. The same as everybody else. There was nothing unusual at all about her behaviour or her mood. Saturday the 22nd of December 1979 was one of the busiest shopping days of the year in Newbridge. People were collecting last-minute presents. The town was crowded and there was a steady flow of buses and traffic from early afternoon into the evening. Phyllis arrived into the town with a clear plan in her head. She was finishing her Christmas shopping, visiting some of her family and friends, and then going home that evening. Despite it being one of the coldest winters in many years, Phyllis, as I said, was determined to finish that Christmas shopping. She bought presents for her parents and her siblings. She chose a pair of boots for herself. She also carried an overnight bag with her, something she often brought just in case she decided to stay with her family overnight. During the afternoon, she went to the hairdressers on Main Street for a wash and set, which was a very common thing to do back in those days. And those who saw her remembered nothing unusual. They said she was her usual polite self and in very good form. She did not appear to be rushed or worried about anything and was preparing for Christmas the same way everybody else was in town that day. From the shops, she went to the home of some of her friends, the Martins. Later, she left the Martins and went to visit her brother Gerard. She arrived with her bags and stayed for a short while. Gerard said she was cheerful, talking about the gifts she had got and looking forward to the days ahead. He said there was nothing unusual about their conversation. It was very ordinary, and there was nothing about her mood or behaviour that stood out to him. After leaving Gerard's house, she went to her friend Barbara Luker's house. She then left Barbara's to go to the bus stop between 6:30 and 6:40 p.m, which was just a few houses away on the same side of the road, just across from the Keaton Hotel. She was dressed in an overcoat, had her shopping bags, and she was wearing a pair of gloves. And that was the last time anybody would see her alive. It was a familiar location for anyone travelling towards Rathangan or the surrounding areas. At this point in the evening, it was dark, but the town was still busy with shoppers and people moving around between the pubs and the shops. As I said, the last confirmed sighting of Phyllis was at the bus stop. She was seen standing alone with her bags, waiting. She was not talking to anybody and she did not seem in any distress. But no one saw her get on the bus. There was no confirmed sighting of her after this point. When her family did not hear from her the following day, they grew concerned quickly. It was totally out of character for her not to have been in contact with any of the family. Phyllis was reliable. She did not change her plans. She did not stay out without telling someone. As the day went on and they still had not heard from Phyllis, they contacted other relatives, neighbours and anyone who might have seen her. No one had seen her. The Gardaí were contacted and family members began searching the area between Newbridge and her home. They checked bus routes, the roads, the lanes. They spoke to people who had been in Newbridge the night before, but nobody had seen her after the bus stop. On December 23rd, while out searching an area near Colgan's Cut, Phyllis Murphy's boots and cardigan were found. This discovery confirmed that something had happened after she'd arrived at the bus stop. A few days later, during another search, more of her belongings were found, and that was the gloves and the belt of her overcoat. Now, the gloves were curious, according to Mr. Jurek, who was counsel for the prosecution, because the gloves had 60 pence in them, and 60 pence was the bus fare to Kildare at the time. The location also raised questions. The items were not hidden, and yet they had not been seen in earlier searches. The placement just didn't make any sense to those who knew the area, and it deepened her family's fear for her safety. Word had spread quickly that a young woman was missing, and people across the county responded. Volunteers joined the search, as well as the army, the sub-aqua squad and dog teams. Farmers opened their land, groups walked the fields, looking in ditches and back roads around Rathangan, Newbridge and further out towards Wicklow. The scale of the community effort was significant, Despite all this, there was no trace of Phyllis. As the days passed, the situation became more serious. Gardaí initially held out some hope that she might turn up, but as the days moved on into a week, that belief began to fade. The extremely cold weather continued and the nights were just so long. There was no sightings, no messages, and no sign that she had travelled anywhere on her own. Her disappearance made no sense. The searches continued every day. They went over the same ground repeatedly. They checked ditches and laneways. They followed any rumours or suggestion that might lead somewhere. The waiting was unbearable. Every hour that passed without news made the situation more real and more frightening for her family. The last confirmed fact from that night remained the same. Phyllis was seen standing at the bus stop with her bags. After that moment, her movements are unknown. Nothing about her background or personality suggested she left willingly. There was no reason to walk away from her life and every reason to go home that night. The weeks dragged on with no sign of Phyllis until the 18th of January 1980, almost a month after Phyllis went missing. Her body was discovered on the way towards Turlock Hill Power Station in Wicklow. That in itself was 28 miles from Colgan's Cut, where her gloves and other clothing were found on St. Stephen's Day. The location was isolated, surrounded by dense trees and rough ground. You would not be there unless you had a reason to be there. It was not on any of the walking routes. It was not a shortcut. It was well off the beaten track. Her body was found by a Garda search team, with retired Detective Sergeant John McManus, a member of that search team, being one of the first to see her body among the trees. The ground was uneven and the vegetation was thick. When he looked closer, he realised he was looking at a body. There were about 10 of us, 5 on each side of the road, he said. We started off from the power station at about 9:45 a.m. We intended to search from the side of the road in 50 yards on each side. At Ballynagee, I was looking into the trees and I saw what appeared to be a body. I called Garda Darmody and we went in to investigate. We found the body of a female lying there. That was at about 11:50 a.m. The body was partially covered with twigs and small branches from the waist down to the feet. The remoteness of the location made access difficult. Vehicles needed to approach slowly. The terrain was steep in places and visibility through the trees was limited. Some of her missing clothing was never recovered. The fact that she had been missing for almost a month was obvious from the condition of her remains. The winter weather had been harsh. There had been frost, snow and days of continuous cold. These conditions would have affected the scene and any trace evidence. The post-mortem confirmed that she had been strangled. She had also been beaten and sexually assaulted. These findings were clear and were later confirmed in court. The injuries suggested violence that was deliberate and sustained. There was no uncertainty about that fact. It was a murder carried out with force. Now, as I said, the condition of her body showed that she had been out in that location for weeks, but the winter climate had slowed down decomposition, but had increased difficulties for a forensic examination. The area around the remains gave Gardaí very little to work with. Any footprints or tyre marks that might have been there earlier could have been washed away by the snow and the rain. The positioning of the body indicated that she had been carried or dragged a short distance in under the trees, and the site was not visible from the road. It was a deliberate placement in a remote area, away from houses, farms or any passing traffic. Gardaí were clear from the onset that the person who placed her there knew the area and had scouted it. It had not been chosen at random. Once confirmation of her identity was made, Gardaí notified the family. It ended weeks of uncertainty, but did not answer any of the questions they needed answered. Who had done this to Phyllis? After the discovery, the investigation intensified. Detectives from Naas and Wicklow were involved. They carried out a full search of the surrounding area, though the terrain made it difficult. Search teams worked through the trees, drainage ditches and access points around the site. They looked for clothing, jewellery or discarded items that might relate to the body. Nothing significant was found. The only confirmed items linked to Phyllis had already been recovered near Colgan's Cut in the days after she went missing. No additional personal belongings were found. The Gardaí examined the possible routes that might have been used to reach the site. The Wicklow Gap Road is long, exposed and sparsely populated. Traffic would have been minimal at night in winter. The person who brought her there would have needed a vehicle. Efforts were made to establish whether anyone had seen unusual activity on the road in the days after she disappeared. Gardaí spoke to locals, farmers, forestry workers and anyone who travelled the route regularly. No useful sightings were reported. The area was simply too remote and too quiet for anyone to have noticed passing vehicles. Because of the condition of the scene and the impact of weather, forensic opportunities were extremely limited. The pathologist took all samples possible at the time. Crucially, biological samples were preserved, even though technology back in 1980 could not properly analyse them. These preserved samples would later prove vital when DNA technology developed in the 1990s. In the early days of the investigation, Garda questioned people who had been in Newbridge on the day she disappeared. They followed up on her final visits. They checked the bus timetable, the drivers on duty, and anyone who might have been at the Keaton Hotel stopped that evening. No confirmed witness saw her after that initial last sighting of her standing at the bus stop. That remained the only fixed point in the timeline. Detectives also examined the area at Colgan's Cut where her belongings were found. The location of those items did not match the direction of her home and did not match the Ballinaghee site. This created an early problem for the investigators. The belongings were found close to Newbridge. The body was found deep in the Wicklow Mountains. There was nothing connecting the two areas except that both were remote. Investigators believe the belongings had been placed at Colgan's Cut rather than dropped accidentally. The family had searched that spot earlier and believed the items were not there that first time. Many interviews were carried out with people who knew Phyllis, including co-workers, relatives and acquaintances. There was no indication of any dispute or threat to her life. She had no known enemies. She had ended a long relationship earlier that year, but there was nothing to suggest involvement from that direction. Gardaí found no evidence pointing towards anyone she knew. In these early weeks of the investigation, progress was slow. There was no eyewitnesses. There was no traceable route. There was no forensic breakthrough available with the technology of the time. The case depended largely on preserved evidence, good record keeping and future developments in science. That decision to preserve samples, as I said, would be crucial. But in 1980, investigators did not have the tools to interpret them. Pathologists did what they could. They documented the injuries and recorded the cause of death, but they could not identify an offender from biological material. It was evidence waiting for technology that had not yet been developed. As the time went on, the investigation began to slow down. Gardaí kept the file open but had no suspect to pursue. Interviews that had been done in the initial weeks were logged, statements were stored, evidence was preserved. Without new information, the case reached a point where nothing further could be done. The file remained active, but in practical terms, the case went cold.
This killer during this time was living a double life of being probably a family man, with going home to his wife and kids every day, and also holding down a job with work colleagues. And none of these people had any idea of the terrible act he had carried out.
Years passed. Forensic science advanced significantly through the 80s and 90s. DNA profiling became a tool that transformed investigations. Gardaí began reviewing older cases where biological samples had been preserved. In the late 1990s, the Garda Cold Case Unit was developing its work under an initiative known as Operation Trace. This operation focused on unsolved murders of women and the possibility that new forensic technology could identify offenders who had not been detected at the time. Phyllis Murphy's case was included. The samples collected during her post-mortem remained usable. This became one of the critical turning points of the investigation. In 1998, the preserved biological material was sent for DNA testing under modern techniques. It was the first time the evidence had been examined with the level of detail and accuracy. The results produced a clear DNA profile. When that profile was compared against known samples held by the Defence Forces and the Gardaí, a match was identified. The profile matched that of John Crear, a retired army sergeant who had served in the Defence Forces for many years. The match was confirmed through additional forensic analysis to eliminate any margin of error. Once confirmed, Gardaí moved quickly to prepare for an arrest. Crear had been living a quiet life in the years since Phyllis's death. He had retired from the army and worked in various roles. Reports from the time stated that he had continued to live in the general Leinster area. He had been interviewed along with other men from the area in the initial investigation. But despite this, the DNA evidence was the first and only time he could be connected to the case. The Gardaí began building the file for the Director of Public Prosecution. This involved reviewing every step of the 1980 investigation, checking the handling of the investigation, confirming the preservation of the samples, and establishing a clear chain of custody from the time the samples were taken to the moment they were analysed. This is standard procedure in any case where DNA evidence is central. Everything must be documented precisely. The file also included the results of the new forensic testing and the confirmation from the independent laboratory. Once the DPP was satisfied that the evidence was strong, Gardaí moved to arrest Crear. He was arrested on the 13th July 1999 at 7:25am at Session Stud, County Kildare, and he was then taken to the Naas Garda station on suspicion of the murder of Phyllis Murphy. The arrest was carried out without incident. He denied any involvement in her death and gave false information about his whereabouts on the evening of the incident. He maintained that position throughout the interview and the legal process. Gardaí questioned him extensively, but he provided no explanation for the DNA match. After the interviews, he was formally charged the following day on the 14th. Following his arrest, Gardaí carried out searches of locations linked to him. But by that stage, almost 20 years had passed. No physical evidence remained that could be connected to the case. The investigation focused on the DNA evidence and any witness statements, the original scene files and the reconstructed timeline of his movements in the late 1990s. Gardaí confirmed publicly that the DNA match was central to the case. After retiring from the Defence Forces and at the time of Phyllis's murder, Crear was working as a security guard at the Black & Decker plant in Kildare. A former member of the Defence Forces who worked as a security guard with John on the night Phyllis disappeared would also later tell the court that he had lied in his first statement to Gardaí in 1999. He had given John an alibi for the night in question. He would later retract that first statement. He told how in December 1979 he was on free discharge from the army and working as a security guard with the provincial security at the Black & Decker plant. John was also working with provincial. The colleague said he had spent the afternoon of December 22nd shopping with his wife and family in Newbridge. On the way home, 5 of them went to a pub and John was there. He said he left at about 20 to 7. He went home, had his tea and then changed into his uniform and went to work, arriving at the Black & Decker plant at around 8 o'clock. He said John turned up around 20 to 9 or so. He pulled up outside the security hut in his car and said there was something wrong with it. He said John told him that he had hit a bump in the road and the battery had fell out, before saying, "I'll be back in a while. I'm going down to O'Leary's to play darts." And then he went off. According to his colleague, he would later arrive back about 25 to or 20 to 11 that night. As the case moved towards trial, the prosecution prepared the evidence. They included the post-mortem findings, the preserved forensic samples, the DNA match, the expert testimony explaining how the technology worked and why it was reliable. The defence challenged aspects of the chain of custody, but the court accepted the preservation process as sound. The evidence was strong enough to proceed. In the lead up to the trial, media reporting focused on the breakthrough. Cases from the 1970s and 80s rarely had forensic links strong enough to support a prosecution 2 decades later. This one did. The scientific evidence met the standard necessary for court. Gardaí made it clear that without the preserved material, the case could not have been solved. The decision to keep the samples stored for so long became the key factor that made justice possible. Throughout the process, Creer continued to deny the crime. He offered no alternative explanation for the DNA evidence. There was no credible explanation available to him. He was the only match. His presence in the relevant region at the relevant time was established through the Defence Forces records and his own service history, as well as his occupation as a security guard. By 2002, the case was ready for trial. The prosecution relied, as I said, on that DNA evidence, the original investigation files, the pathologist's findings, and witness testimonies. The trial took place in the Central Criminal Court in Dublin in 2002. This was more than 20 years after her death. The case was presided over by Mr. Justice Liam McKechnie. The prosecution began by outlining the full timeline of events. They set out Phyllis's final confirmed sighting at the bus stop on the 22nd of December 1979. They explained the discovery of her belongings near Colgan's Cut on the following days and the finding of her body in a remote forestry area on the 18th of January. They detailed the original post-mortem findings and the steps Gardaí took to preserve biological samples at the time. Expert witnesses told the court that the chance of the DNA belonging to anyone else was extremely small. The match was verified through an independent laboratory before Gardaí made the arrest. The prosecution then addressed Creer's background in the Defence Forces and his work as a security guard, which placed him within a reasonable distance of both Newbridge and the Wicklow Gap area, where her body was later found. One of the key issues examined in court was whether he knew Phyllis Murphy or her family before her disappearance. In a statement given to the Gardaí in January 1980, he said he did not know Phyllis personally and claimed that he had never spoken to her. He did, however, acknowledge that he knew members of her family, including her father and sisters, through earlier local connections. The Murphy family gave account in evidence, telling the court that Phyllis and her sisters had previously babysat for his family. This account formed an important part of the trial narrative. It raised questions about the level of familiarity which existed between them before Phyllis vanished. In the end, the court did not have to settle the question of precisely how well he knew Phyllis, because the DNA evidence would speak for itself. The court then heard the original post-mortem evidence. The cause of death, as I said, had been manual strangulation. Phyllis had been beaten and sexually assaulted. It was a violent attack. Her body had been found stripped of clothes and jewellery. The state pathologist, John Harbison, reported 25 separate injuries, bruisings and abrasions to her head, face, neck, arms and legs. Among the injuries was a bruise to the left temple consistent with marks from a boot-type footwear, and extensive bruising on the side of her skull, though no fracture was found. There were defensive injuries on the arms and wrists, indicating Miss Murphy may have tried to fight off her attacker. And of course, further post-mortem results showed evidence of a serious sexual assault on Phyllis. All the defence could do was challenge the chain of custody. They questioned whether the evidence had been handled and stored properly over the previous 20 years. They also questioned the reliability of DNA testing on samples that had been kept for so long. They continued their argument, saying there was no eyewitnesses and no direct identification of Creer at the time of the murder. They pointed out that no witness had seen him with Phyllis on the night she disappeared. This was counter-argued by the prosecution, who said he offered no explanation for the DNA match and none could be found. Creer maintained his innocence throughout the trial. He denied any involvement in Phyllis's murder, and as I said, he couldn't provide an explanation for the DNA match. His denial remained consistent, but it was unsupported by any evidence. Closing arguments were presented to the jury. The prosecution told them the case was built on preserved evidence, scientific analysis and a clear DNA match. The defence told the jury that the passage of time made the case uncertain and argued that the absence of eyewitnesses created doubt. The judge instructed the jury to consider the case solely on the evidence presented. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Creer was convicted of the murder of Phyllis Murphy. Mr. Justice McKechnie delivered the sentence. He described the crime as violent and deliberate and noted the significance of the forensic breakthrough that allowed the case to be brought to trial after so many years. And then he sentenced John Creer to life imprisonment. For the Murphy family, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but also deep pain. They had lived through more than 2 decades of uncertainty. They had searched fields, ditches and roadsides in the days after her disappearance. They had lived with the knowledge that someone had taken her life and had remained free for all those years. After the verdict, they released statements thanking the Gardaí and the forensic experts who had worked on the case. They said justice had finally been achieved, but acknowledged that it could never undo the loss. The conviction became one of Ireland's clearest examples of the power of modern forensic science. It showed the importance of preserving biological evidence even when its use is not immediately apparent. The decision made in 1980 to store those samples was the reason the case could be solved. Without that, the murder of Phyllis Murphy would have remained unsolved. The trial also reinforced the value of long-term investigative work. It demonstrated that even after decades, a case can be reopened and progressed if the evidence had been properly preserved. It gave hope to families of other missing and murdered women whose cases remain unsolved. The conclusion of the trial marked the official end of the legal process. Creer was convicted and imprisoned. For the Murphy family, the verdict was an end to one chapter, but did not diminish the years of grief they had lived through. Phyllis had been preparing for Christmas, visiting family and friends and getting her shopping done when her life was taken. The trial brought accountability, but the loss remained. Their focus remained on Phyllis and on ensuring she was remembered properly. The discovery of her body in January 1980 had brought them a measure of closure, but it was not the end. They still faced the reality that someone had taken her life and had lived freely for years. The verdict confirmed who was responsible and brought them the final step of justice. Public reaction to the conviction reflected the significance of the case. It became known as one of the clearest examples in Ireland of how modern forensic science could solve an older case. Many people had assumed that murders from the 1970s and 1980s were beyond the reach of new investigations. This case showed that preserved evidence could be analysed decades later with results strong enough to stand up in court. The role of the DNA evidence received significant coverage, with reports explaining how the profile had been matched and why it was decisive. Gardaí also commented on the case publicly. They highlighted the importance of having preserved that biological sample, even when there was no immediate use for it back in 1980. Detectives working under Operation Trace confirmed that without those samples, the case would never have been reopened. They pointed to this case as an example of why cold case units needed proper resources and why older files should never be written off. The case also had an impact on how families of missing or murdered viewed historic investigations. It showed that even when decades pass, new developments in forensic science can bring answers. Many families dealing with similar losses followed the coverage closely. The conviction offered a sense of hope. It demonstrated that progress was possible as long as evidence was being preserved and the case remained open. Within the Gardaí, the case reinforced the value of cold case reviews. Operation Trace focused on violent crimes against women and used modern forensic techniques to revisit older cases. The Phyllis Murphy investigation became a reference point within the operation. It showed the importance of revisiting cases as technology improves. It also supported the argument for dedicated funding and personnel for cold case work. The conviction confirmed that these resources were worth maintaining. It highlighted the limitations faced by investigators in earlier decades and showed how technology changed the landscape of criminal investigation. The case also influenced public understanding of the work carried out by the cold case teams. It demonstrated that these investigations require long-term commitment, proper resources, and support from forensic experts. It showed that successful outcomes depend on the decisions made at the very beginning of an investigation. In this case, the decision to preserve the evidence was the difference between a case that remained unsolved and a case that could eventually be closed. Phyllis Murphy was a young woman just living a normal life. She spent her last days doing the same things many people do in the days before Christmas. She was working through her shopping list, visiting her family and making plans.
We didn't want her forgotten. We wanted the true story of what she was really like to come out. We never wanted it just a murder case.
At 20, between 20, 21 maybe, very happy looking now. You'd probably be a granny now with kids.
I'd walk to where Phyllis is. I'd lay a read there. We can't forget her.
What happened to her was an act of violence carried out in the most brutal way, and it changed the course of her family's lives. It took more than 20 years for the truth to reach a courtroom, but the work done by the Gardaí and the cold case teams made sure the answers were finally found. The conviction brought justice, but it can never remove the loss felt by her family. What remains is the importance of remembering who she was and the life she lived before that December evening. Right guys, that's a wrap for 2025. I want to thank you all for your listenership, and I want to wish everyone a very, very Merry Christmas. I wish you nothing but merriment and happiness with your family and friends over the Christmas period, and best wishes for 2026. I hope it's a wonderful year for each and every one of you. Over the next couple of weeks, I'll be putting out 2 episodes, 2 interviews that I did previously. One with Gina Curry, who is Imelda Keenan's niece. That'll be going out, along with my interview with Damien Hipwell, who is best friends with Dean Roach. So you can listen back on those 2 episodes again. And I will be back with you on the 11th of January. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you all for your listenership over the year and over the years at this stage. And I look forward to what 2026 brings for us. The first episode, as I said, will be out on the 11th of January with Kieran McConnell joining me, and we will be discussing Antoinette Smith's disappearance and subsequent murder back in 1987. So that'll be the first episode going out of season 4. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank GoLoud. They've been an amazing support to me since I joined up with them earlier on in the year. So with that being said, I want to say thank you again and wish you all a Merry Christmas, and I will see you all on the 11th of January. So guys, that's it for today's episode of the Ireland Crimes and Mysteries podcast. Again, thanks for your listenership, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and hit that auto download so you never miss an episode. Until the next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. This podcast has been compiled from information gathered in the public sphere, like news articles, documentaries, and open source material that can be found on the web. Everything in this podcast is alleged unless a conviction has taken place.